Welcome to this second most substantive part of Heritage Encounters. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Chris Whitehead, and I'm Professor of Museology here at Newcastle University and Professor of Heritage Studies at the University of Oslo in Norway. So I'm going to just kick things off today, and my primary duty is to introduce Professor Rodney Harrison, which I will do in a moment, after letting you know that, as with yesterday, there are no fire drills planned. So if you hear an alarm, assume that it's real and leave the building. And also, I've been asked to clarify the situation with the toilets because they're a little hard to locate. Okay, so there are, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, as our resident toilet expert. There are toilets downstairs, and they're easy to get to, and then there are toilets on a mezzanine floor, which I believe you need to take a lift for, okay? So that's absolutely right. So that's the situation. I think it probably has something to do with, I see some people pointing upwards.
There's also toilets on the top floor, Chris.
Okay, okay. Top floor. I think it has something to do with the fact that this is a listed building, and so there are various architectural games that have had to be played to make it work. So you're also in a heritage site of sorts. Okay, that preamble done, I can now, with pleasure, introduce our second keynote of this conference and exhibition, Rodney Harrison, who's Professor of Heritage Studies at UCL Institute of Archaeology, educated at the University of Western Australia before working for National Parks and Wildlife Service as a historical archaeologist and as Regional Aboriginal Heritage Studies Coordinator, and then, after that, moving to the UK. He's founding editor and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology, a founding executive committee member of the Association of Critical Heritage Studies, with the UK chapter of which this conference has been developed. A very prolific author and co-editor of a seemingly impossible and unfeasible number of great books. I sometimes wonder whether there are actually many Rodneys. There's some clones out there, I think. These books include, of course, Heritage, Critical Approaches, which is a key plank of many of our course reading lists, and I'm sure many of yours as well. Rodney is also, I would say, a real champion for the field and a real collegiate soul, as I know from personal experience of having worked with him. And that also leads into his role as AHRC Heritage Priority Area Leadership Fellow, through which, and I'm going to quote a little bit of an interview here, Rodney aims to bring together different fields or practices that are not normally in conversation with one another. Heritage researchers and practitioners are quite dispersed and exist in pockets in many different places. Heritage doesn't exist in one field. Archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, geographers, chemists, biologists, planners and architects, and many other professions all have an interest in it. And that tallies really closely with the articulation of heritage studies here at Newcastle, as you will see, not just in the conference proceedings that follow today, but also in the small exhibition that we've organized for you. And the exhibition has two functions. First, so that none of you have to look awkward if suddenly you've got no one to talk to. You can always just zone out on a screen for a while. And if you see somebody zoning out on a screen, then go and talk to them. Second, it highlights the multi and interdisciplinary range and depth of funded heritage research at Newcastle. Now, as well as being a champion of interdisciplinarity and a collegiate leader of the field, Rodney is also currently principal investigator of the Heritage Futures large AHRC research program, which focuses on heritage as a future-making practice. What is conserved and cared for now will become building blocks for the future. And this puts him in the vanguard of a range of scholars who are interested in dispelling for good any notion that heritage studies is simply about caring for old stuff, positing instead that our engagements with the past actually enfold complex social, political, ethical, material and affective concerns that point forwards in time to futures that we make or that we imagine. And again, this tallies with our interest at Newcastle as a civic university in tackling global and societal challenges to shape our futures for the better. And for all of these reasons, Rodney's participation today is entirely apt. I've been trying for a long time to get him here, so it's great that he's here. And we're delighted to hear him talk about heritage futures and the value of comparative research to critical heritage studies. So I give the floor to you, Rodney.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here too. And I'm sorry that I missed yesterday's opening, but by all accounts, a super opening to what I'm sure will also be another super day today. So thank you very much. So I'm really pleased to be able to be here to present about the research that we'll be doing on the Heritage Futures research project. I have some of my colleagues from the team here, and I'll introduce them in a moment when I talk a little bit about the team and the sort of framing of the project. But I wanted to begin by saying something about where this project emerges from. And it's often said that conservation or preservation of natural or cultural heritage is something which is done for the future or on behalf of future generations. And these cliches tend to lend moral weight to conservation, but the precise relationship of these practices, conservation practices, to the future is less often reflected upon. So while it's customary to think about conservation or preservation as something that we do to maintain what remains of biological or cultural diversity from the past, it's rarely the case that we discuss seriously and critically the role of preservation practices of many different kinds in assembling and making futures. So in this talk, I want to draw on the work of the Heritage Futures Research Programme to explore how conservation practices of different kinds might be thought to assemble and resource different kinds of futures, the nature of the different future worlds each might be said to be resourcing, and the capacities of these different practices to resource these futures. And I do so as an illustration of what I see as the general value of taking a more critical and comparative approach to heritage practices and considering heritage broadly defined in comparison with other aligned fields of practices. No, there. So Heritage Futures is a 4-year collaborative international research program funded by an Arts and Humanities Research Council Care for the Future theme large grant, supported additionally by its host universities and its partner organisations. The research program involves ambitious interdisciplinary research to explore the potential for innovation and creative exchange across a broad range of heritage and related fields, or what we refer to as domains of practice, in partnership with a number of academic and non-academic institutions and interest groups. It's distinctive in its comparative approach, which aims to bring heritage conservation practices of various forms into closer dialogue with the management of other material and virtual legacies, such as nuclear waste. And it's also distinctive in its exploration of different forms of heritage as distinctive future-making practices. And we're currently into the 4th of 4 years on the research program. So here you can see our international interdisciplinary research team, composed of 15 researchers, each of whom works across one or more of our 4 main themes in collaboration with our 25-odd academic and non-academic partner organisations. And you can see a growing list of our partner organisations on this slide, which I have to squeeze more and more people onto every time I give a talk. But some of these partner organisations will be familiar to you and others will be less familiar. We work across a very broad range of heritage and heritage-related domains. So some of these are things that we might not conventionally think of as being heritage. In particular, deep space messaging and nuclear waste management, both of which are things that I'll touch on in a moment. But the aim of the project is to look across a very, very broad range of different fields, to think about what they have in common with one another, and to think about how each is involved in resourcing specific kinds of future worlds. So central to the project is this idea that futures are not simply emergent, but that futures are designed. And what I mean by this is that futures are built and assembled as a result of actions in the present, which are formed out of particular constellations of things, places, persons, and practices, and they're coming together, sometimes in conflict and sometimes in collaboration with one another, at particular moments in time. And we use the term conservation within the project broadly to refer to the maintenance of plants, animals, languages, practices, ideas, persons, things, traces, residues, and materials from the past in the present for the future. And we often hear this claim made, as I said, about heritage being something from the past that's conserved for future generations. But most importantly, we see that different forms of conservation practices often work towards assembling quite different futures and quite divergent future worlds. And in doing so, they have the potential to undermine or come into conflict with one another. So the research program asks its partner organisations to think through the different kinds of futures they're involved in making within their own organisations, through the specific conservation practices that they employ, and to explore how these might relate to those of others. And in this sense, the project aims to encourage its partners to develop shared, integrated responses to common problems, many of which touch on issues of global concern. The project works across 4 themes, each of which identifies a challenge for the future of heritage and looks at a range of institutions which aim to tackle it in different ways. And these themes are uncertainty. So how is the uncertainty of the deep future conceived of and managed in different fields of conservation practice? Transformation, what values are associated with heritage structures and landscapes that are allowed to undergo transformation and change? Profusion, how do museums and people in their homes decide what to keep in the face of mass production and consumption? And diversity, how are biological, cultural, genetic, and linguistic diversity categorised and conserved, and what can one field learn from the other? Within these different areas, we undertake fieldwork focusing on heritage and other forms of conservation practices to understand what is done and why, including assumptions and values of which participants might be unaware, with a range of different groups and institutions who work with different heritage and heritage-like fields. And then we aim to work with these groups to identify how specific strategies and practices from each of these fields might be creatively redeployed in others. Our methods draw broadly on archaeological material and visual ethnography, but also incorporate documentary research, creative artistic practice, ethnographic filmmaking. So I would encourage you to have a look at our website, because all of the research associates, or most of the research associates on the research program, have been engaged in making different kinds of research film, and we have a Vimeo channel that is associated with the research program, and you can see the films on either linking from our website or on the Vimeo channel. But our research also engages what we call creative knowledge exchange. And in this, we've been strongly influenced by the forms of experimental, collaborative, para-ethnographic practices that have characterised anthropological approaches to the contemporary, particularly thinking about the work of Holmes and Marcus and Paul Rabineau, in which ethnographers come together with other expert knowledge producers in the development of shared critical insights which cut across the fields in which we work. To do this, we've facilitated a series of inter- and intra-thematic thought experiments, collaborative knowledge exchange events in which researchers and members of the various partner organisations with which we work come together around field visits and collaborative workshops to explore shared questions relating to futures, world-making and creative engagements with ruin and environmental change. And these have and will include a range of different kinds of activities, from collective visits to explore archival architectures at the site of the long-term nuclear waste repository, which is currently being constructed by our partners SKB in Forsmark in Sweden, to thought experiments relating to the different ordering and worlding practices across the various collections at Kew in London, to discussions of natural and cultural heritage transformation in context of climate-related coastal change on the Sussex coast. Conceptually, the project is influenced by what's been termed the ontological turn in the social sciences, in particular Karen Barad's agential realism and various aspects of science and technology studies, and seeing heritage practices of various kinds as enacting new realities through contingent practices of assembling and reassembling bodies, techniques, technologies, materials, values, temporalities and spaces in different ways. Central here is a plural notion of heritage ontologies, understood as the world-making, future-assembling capacities of heritage practices of different kinds, and the ways in which different heritage practices might be seen to enact different realities and hence hold the potential to assemble radically different future worlds. And in looking across the various professional fields which are implicated in promulgating such practices, the project seeks to make a specific contribution to current discussions relating to the value of comparison in the humanities and social and historical sciences, expanding them to the study of human and non-human collectives. We do this because we think that a comparative analysis of different kinds of natural and cultural conservation and preservation practices might develop and open up the notion of heritage in creative and productive ways, and also help us to explore what social and material work is facilitated by the doing of heritage, which we see as a fundamental goal of heritage studies as a critical field of research. Through focusing on conservation or preservation as a series of distinct creative dialogical engagements between human and non-human persons, objects, places and practices, we aim to explore heritage as a series of distinctive processes rather than the end products of such practices, or indeed simply as the values that are associated with those end products of those practices. And through a new emphasis on heritage as forms of inheritance, which may be positively, negatively, or even ambiguously valued, we aim to bring the field of critical heritage studies into conversation with the study of other hyperobjects or Anthropocene legacies, such as waste and climate. We argue that a reframed notion of heritage as material and discursive legacy will allow us to move beyond the uncritical valorizing of certain objects, places, and practices from the past in the present to reorient heritage studies more explicitly as a study of future-making or worlding practices by showing how such things and the practices by which they realized form templates for the organization of new contingent realities and the construction of divergent future worlds. Working across natural and cultural heritage, our work is informed by Chakrabarty's observations of the ways in which research in what we might call the climate change era forces a dissolution of the distinction between natural and cultural history. Here we intersect with a new critical engagement with nature conservation and extinction studies, thinking particularly of the work of people like Debbie Bird-Rose and Tom Van Duren and others, in exploring the distinctive social and cultural frameworks which produce natural heritage and the ways in which cultural heritage is not outside of but integrally a part of these frameworks. Our work also connects both conceptually and empirically with recent anthropological engagements with futures and with current creative academic engagements with global climatological and environmental change. But the aim of this talk is to work through some of the ways in which the comparison between heritage and waste, which forms one of the distinctive aspects of this Heritage Futures research program, might generate new insights for heritage. In doing so, I draw initial inspiration from geographer Kevin Hetherington's framing of heritage as a category of both spatial and discursive placing, which relates to broader, often cyclical practices of consumption and management of redundancy. In particular, I want to look at how bringing heritage and waste together helps us to re-theorize both as forms of material and discursive legacy, and to reconsider the ontological implications of living with, caring for, and assembling futures out of such more or less persistent traces, residues, and materials in the present. I then begin to map out a series of key conceptual terms which might provide the beginnings of a critical toolkit of concepts with which to navigate this newly expanded intellectual field. Not yet. So heritage is a term that simultaneously identifies an object, place, or practice as something that has value, as something which is considered to be threatened and something which is considered to be threatened or at risk. This risk may simply be a result of the inherent perceived threat of time itself, which implies processes of forgetting, decay, eroding, becoming worn with age. Sometimes this threat is a more active one of demolition or destruction, the flattening of a building, the bulldozing of a tree, destruction of a tract of landscape by mining, for example. Or perhaps even more seriously, the extinctions of plant and animal species or the genocide of a group of people during times of war. This element of potential or real threat of heritage, of destruction, loss and decay, links heritage historically and politically with a broader endangerment sensibility. And I borrow this term from my colleagues Fernando Vidal and Nelia Dias, which connects practices of cultural and natural heritage preservation across a range of different domains. This endangerment sensibility is articulated by way of practices of designation and listing, and I draw here particularly on the work of Trinidad Rico on the relationship between heritage and risk. Even where a building, species, or object is under no immediate threat of destruction, its listing on a heritage register as something which is rare, unique, or valuable assumes a potential threat at some time in the future from which it is being protected by designation or legislation. I was going to show these slides next. So these are 4 of heritage's endangered objects: red wolf, tropical rainforest, Albert Dock, and the Ainu language. And these are some of the ways in which that form of endangerment is articulated through listing, through lists of heritage in danger, endangered languages lists. And again, the list of World Heritage in danger. So, waste, on the other hand, is a term which is clearly negatively valued. It designates a redundant object or useless byproduct of some other operation. It's neither valuable nor at risk, although it may pose a risk to others. Yet both heritage and waste emerge from the same process of redundancy. These are both terms that designate superfluous objects which are no longer useful for the purpose for which they were originally produced. So the museum and the rubbish dump might then be seen as two potential spatial endpoints for such redundant objects. Or perhaps not so much endpoints as points in a cycle of consumption and reuse, as categories of spatial and discursive placement. So Kevin Hetherington argues that disposal is not just about questions of waste and rubbish, but is implicated more broadly in the ways in which people manage absence within social relations. Further, he explains that disposal is never final, as is implied in the notion of rubbish or waste, but that disposal is a continual practice of engaging with making and holding things in a state of absence. So while Hetherington's concern here is with practices of consumption more broadly, I think his focus on the work of maintaining absence draws out another similarity between heritage and waste, which is that both are defined by practices of maintenance and containment. Intangible heritage practices require performance to maintain and preserve. Nature and biodiversity are actively managed by processes of ecosystem service, repair and management. Endangered languages are recorded and archived, become extinct, and might possibly be rediscovered and live again. But the important point here is that heritage and waste occupy a series of other spaces, outside of the realm of everyday life, set apart, sometimes hidden away in vaults, archives, banks, museums, repositories of different kinds. And I want to introduce two of these other places in which myself and members of the research program have been working, which I want to return to from time to time throughout the rest of this talk. The first of these is the long-term nuclear waste and spent fuel repository site in Forsmark in Sweden, which is currently being constructed by SKB, who I mentioned is a Swedish nuclear waste management company. And the second is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, currently the world's largest secure seed storage facility, located on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen near Longyearbyen in the remote Arctic Svalbard archipelago, about 1,300 kilometers from the North Pole. Can you tell which is which? I bring them both together here not only to highlight the strikingly similar physical architectures of these two repositories, but also to think more broadly about the shared characteristics of such repositories which are built to contain and manage both heritage and waste. So here we see SKB's tagline, "We take care of Swedish nuclear waste," which invokes another connection between heritage and waste in that they are both designated as things which require human care. And we might think here of the etymological roots of the word curate in the term curare, to care. And in addition to conceiving of heritage as practices of care, one of the things that we've been interested in within the context of our research program is to look at heritage practices which are explicitly framed as not caring, what my colleague Caitlin De Silvi terms curated decay and other forms of relatively benign neglect. The facility at Forsmark currently includes the final repository for short-lived radioactive waste, as well as the facility where the final spent fuel repository for the most harmful radioactive wastes is planned. And since the mid-1980s, Swedish nuclear waste has been managed and cared for at the final repository for short-lived radioactive waste, the SFR, and at the central interim storage facilities for spent nuclear fuel in Oskarshamn. The planned long-term spent fuel repository at Forsmark will ultimately involve the deposition of approximately 12,000 tonnes of spent nuclear fuel. A long ramp will descend to a depth of around 500 metres, where a system of tunnels will be constructed inside the bedrock. When fully developed sometime in the 2080s, the repository will comprise 60 kilometres of tunnels with room for more than 6,000 copper canisters of spent nuclear fuel packed inside bentonite casings. As each section is filled, it will be backfilled with concrete to completely encase the waste in concrete and bedrock. And the total volume of the space required underground in the rock will be approximately 4 cubic kilometres. So in 2017, I'm looking at Sarah because Sarah helped us organise it, we ran a workshop, 2016, we ran a workshop with SKB which constituted a kind of extended field-based thought experiment. What would it mean to plan for the management of materials in the repositories in which various of our different project partners work? across archives and museums and other sorts of biobanks and other forms of repositories. What would it mean to plan for 100,000 years into the future? How might the management practices of archives, frozen zoos, seed and other biobanks, herbaria, historic sites, natural landscapes and museums change if we were to plan for the management of their respective conservation targets over such long durations? And how would the objects of conservation themselves transform and change over those time periods? What emerged clearly from the workshop and the sort of work that Sarah and Cornelius Holtdorf have been doing on the project is that the futures which are planned for in heritage management are of much shorter duration, often only one generation and generally little more, despite the rhetoric of fulfilling the needs of more distant futures. The popular understanding of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault as the Doomsday Seed Vault seems to echo these concerns with long-term, potentially catastrophic futures. Situated on the remote island of Spitsbergen in the Norwegian Svalbard archipelago, high in the Arctic North, it received its first deposits of seeds in 2008. Njordgen, which is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the facility and maintains its public database of samples, reports that it holds approximately 933,000 accessions and over 50 million seeds from 234 countries and 733 depositor institutes inside its frozen repository. Each accession represents an individual crop phenotype and is usually made up of approximately 500 individual seeds. The seed accessions are dried by depositing institutions to limit their moisture content to 5 to 6%, and then sealed inside individual airtight aluminium bags, packed into standard-sized crates, and stacked onto shelving units in one of the 3 separate identical storage vaults, each measuring approximately 9.5 by 27 meters, which are refrigerated to maintain a constant temperature of minus 18 degrees Celsius. These vaults have been excavated approximately 120 meters into the side of a sandstone mountain at a height of 130 meters above sea level, and entry to the vaults is via a 100-meter long entrance tunnel. Equal parts bunker and frozen ark, its dramatic facade includes a commissioned artwork, Perpetual Repercussion, which renders the building visible from far off both day and night using highly reflective stainless steel triangles of various sizes. Cold climate and permafrost ensure that even if power is lost, the storage vaults would remain frozen for significant periods of time, even taking into account the possible effects of climate change and sea level changes. Designed for a virtually infinite lifetime, it is perceived to be robustly secured against external hazards and climate change effects. And I can't remember whether I say something about this later, although famously not so secure because melting permafrost basically ruined the entrance to the seed vault last year. It was fairly widely reported in the media. So, if the robust security of biobanks and nuclear waste repositories tells us something of the similarities between heritage and waste in their managed depositions in these other places, what can we say about the absences and gaps in the landscape which are created by the gathering together of heritage and wastes and their storage in such a manner? And what happens when these effective materials leak from their repositories into the surrounding environment? Drawing on the theme of cultural and historical debt in Derrida's Spectres of Marx, Hetherington suggests that ghosts in the urban landscape represent the traces of unfinished and unmanaged disposals. We might think here of the obsessive conservation of the remaining traces of the Berlin Wall, for example, or the almost fetishistic attempts to conserve the empty niche of the Great Buddha at Bamiyan in Afghanistan following its destruction by the Taliban in 2001. Similarly, the early 21st century is haunted by other ghosts of unmanaged disposals, the vast tracts of plastic wastes which converge within oceanic gyres, this one a picture of the Pacific garbage patch, one of Timothy Morton's hyperobjects. But perhaps even more problematic and more authentically haunting are the invisible anthropogenic waste products. Carbon monoxide as an artifact of agricultural and industrial processes, chemotoxic wastes within waterways, radionuclides within the Earth's geology, which persist as atomic traces of nuclear energy production and warfare. These pollutants haunt us much because they constitute matter out of place, to invoke Mary Douglas's work, and as such they help shine a light more intensely on the ways in which these repositories create new realities through their collecting and ordering practices. One of the complex problems with the management of nuclear and other forms of hazardous waste presents is that the materials themselves transform over time. Marcus Buser points out that certain organic pollutants are transformed into what are termed metabolites by bacteria and chemical decomposition, forming new materials which are often far more toxic than their parent materials. In the same vein, most of us are probably aware of the half-lives of nuclear materials and the ways in which they actively decay. On the other hand, decay contributes both positively and negatively to the aesthetic effects of cultural heritage. The effective power of heritage sites, both positive and negative, also changes, sometimes less predictably, but transforms nonetheless. Conservation and heritage work is framed as a process of slowing or managing such change and decay. However, it's also clear that certain heritage sites also become more or less toxic according to their contextual shifts in their social, material, political, economic, or ecological environments. And I've written elsewhere about the ways in which what might otherwise be valorized and protected as intangible heritage might also form templates for identifying ethnic minorities and targeting them for expulsion, violence, and genocides by majoritarian groups. And here I draw on Arjun Appadurai's work in the book Fear of Small Numbers, in which he considers the connections between globalization and extreme culturally motivated ethnic violence in the genocides that occurred in the 1990s in Eastern Europe, Rwanda, and India, and subsequently in the 2000s in what has been termed the War on Terror, all of which arose under circumstances in which intangible cultural differences amongst minorities became the focus for identifying specific groups for violence and genocide. This issue of transformation is also a poignant one for the seed banks, frozen zoos, and other biobanks with which we're working. At the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, holding seeds at low temperatures aims to halt genetic erosion that might occur in situ in crop genetic material through a combination of natural and cultural processes, thus providing a frozen archive of genetic material which might be recalled in the future. And I draw generally on Sarah Perry's and Jeffrey Bowker's work in using this term recall and thinking about these as archival technologies. Another area where waste studies illuminates heritage is in thinking about waste and heritage as both contained within and defined by zones of exclusion. And I draw here on the work of historian of science Peter Gallison, who notes this resonance across waste and wilderness in his work. Both heritage and waste are articulated through practices of boundary maintenance and selective exclusion of humans. And I've been working in Argentina on a project that's led by a colleague, Trinidad Rico, at Rutgers University, which has been looking at the historical archaeology of the origins of the Argentine nuclear power industry. And here we see how early experimental nuclear science was veiled in secrecy and access controlled to these experimental facilities by situating them within a national park. And in fact, the more one looks, the more examples one sees of this connection between conservation and nuclear waste in particular. There are many national parks that store nuclear waste underground. So wilderness is defined precisely by the absence of human traces, and boundaries manage to exclude such influences. IUCN Category 1B wilderness areas are defined as, quote, protected areas that are usually large, unmodified or slightly modified areas, retaining their natural character and influence without permanent or significant human habitation, which are protected and managed so as to preserve their natural condition. They are large, untouched areas where ecosystem processes, including evolution, can continue unhindered by humans and should be managed in such a way as to limit any human visitation. But in many other less extreme ways, we see heritage as defined by its controlled access and the restriction of human intervention, the ubiquitous glass case of the museum, the roped barrier which keeps visitors from private rooms in country houses, the extreme isolation of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault are all examples. This physical and discursive distance also produces problems of communication which resonate across waste and heritage management. We've become used to the idea that the values of objects, places, and practices managed as heritage are not necessarily legible to ordinary people, and that experts must be engaged to interpret the values of such places to the public. Their values are mediated by interpretive signage, by costume guides, by maps and plans through audio guides. Like heritage, nuclear waste management is dominated by questions of communicating the danger of buried nuclear waste with the life forms which will occupy and inherit this human heritage hundreds of thousands of years into the future. And we work on the project with John Lomberg, who's been involved both in working with extraterrestrial communication. So he worked with Carl Sagan to design the Voyager gold disk. But he also works in this field of nuclear semiotics in helping to communicate or helping to conceive of communicative schemes that will communicate the danger of buried nuclear waste 100,000 years into the future to biological organisms who may or may not be humans. And so we see this sort of strong connection across of communication, both across extraterrestrial communication as well as nuclear waste, nuclear semiotics. So here we see that some of the schemes that have been thought of to communicate this. Another theme which has begun to emerge strongly from the empirical research that we're undertaking within the research program, and again, which I'm exploring further as part of the work which I've been doing under Trinidad Rico's project in Argentina, partially funded by a Global Challenges Research Fund innovation grant, is the ways in which the designation of certain forms of conservation landscape, for example, national parks and other protected areas, facilitate specific forms of environmentally damaging non-conservation activities outside of their borders. And this is a sort of paradox in which conservation must be seen as integrally connected with, but also facilitative of its alter. So landscape conservation emerges to compensate for practices of land degradation. Biodiversity conservation compensates for practices which lead to species extinction, archival practices with the destruction of historical records, and so on. This observation suggests that conservation landscapes in particular cannot be studied without looking at their broader landscape management effects, the salvation of certain forms of designated areas, and the sacrifice this facilitates for others. And this invites a radical rethinking of conservation history. We can't understand the gazettal or protection of buildings or landscapes without looking beyond the gazetted or reserved area to consider the negative actions which such conservation activity permits. The salvation of one endangered object could be said to be bound up with and complicit in the sacrifice of another. Returning to Spitsbergen, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is not a conventional seed bank, but was conceived of as part of a global system to facilitate the secure storage of duplicate backup seeds from national and regional repositories. These backed up copies of seeds are stored free of charge and are held as part of an international agreement in which the seeds remain the property of the depositing institution and are available for withdrawal by the depositing institution, and only that depositing institution, at any time. It's thus not an active gene bank, but a literal vault, a kind of Swiss bank containing a secure stock of duplicate seeds, which can be used if seed stocks from one depositing institution become depleted or lost. And the requirement for such a facility seemed to be clearly demonstrated when, in September 2015, scientists from the International Centre for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, or ICARDA, who had lost access to the gene bank facility in Aleppo and Syria, requested the return of duplicate samples of seeds which had been sent to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault to reconstruct their collection in a new facility in Lebanon. This first withdrawal of seed samples from the vault as a result of ongoing conflict in Syria was reported widely in the media and seemed to indicate clearly that it was already fulfilling a purpose which had previously been assumed would arise in a more distant future, justifying the significant investment in this global insurance policy. The management of the new gene bank facility at Turbol in Bikar was reported to have said of the withdrawal of these seed samples, the vault was not expected to be opened for 150 or 200 years. It would only open in the case of major crises, but we soon discovered that with a crisis at a country level, we needed to open it. And here we see another example of preservation, not so much for the long term, but actually for the very immediate future. Thus, in conjunction with ongoing processes of in situ crop diversity maintenance, themselves subject to continued processes of natural and cultural selection, which alter contemporary global crop diversity, the vault's collection reverses what is understood to be a natural entropic process of diversity decay, one which is accelerated by anthropogenic activity, by increasing crop genetic diversity. And in this sense, the values of the collection also increase with time. So we can think about the vault as a sort of investment bank for the accumulation of specific forms of biocapitals. And indeed, that such facilities might be contributing to the development of a distinctive late modern bioeconomy. So one of the things that I've been working on with Esther Breithoff and Sephram Penrose within the diversity theme in the project where we're working with Frozen Ark and the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is this connection between biodiversity value and an emerging bioeconomy, and the ways in which conservation actually makes value. It's not just about maintaining value, but actively producing it. However, questions of overaccumulation haunt heritage and waste too. The concrete forms which the various apparatuses which have been produced to identify and manage forms of heritage at risk, the registers which form a record of endangered species and ecosystems, the list of World Heritage in Danger and so on, often don't include processes by which these objects may be removed from such registers. The overburdened museum storeroom or the domestic space of the cluttered attic thus become emblematic symbols of these processes of overaccumulation of heritage. And this is the focus for work that's been done in the profusion theme of the project by Sharon MacDonald and Jenny Morgan, who's here, aiming to look at the ways in which profusion is managed both within museums and households in the project. The overaccumulation of stuff, the durability of plastic wastes and their accumulation in alarming quantities in landfill, the problem of managing digital objects and e-waste, noise and light pollution, and indeed the massive growth in human population itself, all speak to the same anxiety of enumerating growth in things as forms of overaccumulation. An obsession with memory practices cuts across these fields too. I've already referred to work in nuclear semantics, which has at its core the study of intergenerational memory practices. Andreas Huyssen points to the emergence of memory and its materialization through memorials, museums and other cultural institutions as one of the key cultural and political phenomena of the late 20th century modernity. Derrida's archive fever points to the obsessive replication of such memory practices across a series of different practical fields. And I take this term memory practices again from Geoffrey Bowker's work, who studies the proliferation of archival and other classificatory systems across various fields of natural sciences. The archive stands in a complicated relation here with the future. It orders and makes new worlds in its structuring of reality. But these acts of deposition, preservation and interpretation are as much practices of forgetting as they are of remembering, as archives are actively selected, selectively retained and impartially interpreted. These selective practices of remembering are also hierarchical practices of valuing. We're reminded here of how the sites for the deposition of chemotoxic and radioactive wastes have also been selected in ways which reflect differentiation in the value of human life between those who benefit from the consumption of the end products from which these wastes are produced and those who are forced to live amongst and are most impacted upon by the presence of those wastes in the environment. I want to conclude with some notes on the light which these comparisons between heritage and waste might shed on living with the legacies of both. And I do so with four further keywords: collusion, contagion, contamination, collaboration. And I take the bringing together of two of these terms from Anna Singh, who notes that we are contaminated by our encounters. They change who we are as we make way for others. As contamination changes world-making projects, mutual worlds and new directions may emerge. Everyone carries a history of contamination. Purity is not an option. Collaboration means working across difference, which leads to contamination. And while I'm interested in the ways in which she develops this line of thinking in relation to concepts of diversity and difference, also key heritage concepts, I want to highlight the ways in which the idea of contamination by chemical and radioactive wastes might help us to look with fresh eyes on the embodied experience or affect of heritage, whilst also helping us to think through the ways in which a sense of collaborating or colluding with material and discursive legacies helps us to begin to look at the possible future-making projects which are implied across these various different domains of practice. My understanding of the potentially effective embodied experience of heritage has perhaps emerged most strongly from my work with Aboriginal people in Australia, for whom the management of the landscape as an aspect of heritage has a direct influence on both collective and individual physical well-being. So, for example, this colleague, old man Arthur Hooper, now deceased, a senior Murawari man, then in his 70s, not in the 1970s, God, and an honorary national park ranger with whom I worked recording the remains of a historic Aboriginal village in northwestern New South Wales in 2001. He said, "Ever since I've been coming out here doing a little bit of work for people, I've been feeling really great. I'm really happy to see this old place again. And my feelings, well, inside me, it's just a really glad feeling. I've got no worries about anything else, no aches and pains. I just walk around the place for hours and hours without getting tired. And June Barker, his contemporary, went on to say, we always liked to go out here to Denawan. We'd look around, and it's hard to describe. Even yesterday I was there, and there's a little bit of a house frame standing, and I got really emotional. I don't know whether you understand, but it's within you. And then yesterday I was out there again with Arthur Hooper, and we went over, and he said, you know, I think this is the place where you used to live, June. And then I walked and I stood and said, yeah, Arthur, this is the place. You don't feel that just anywhere. You only feel that in special places, and Denawan is a special place. It's always going to be set in my heart. Here, heritage is explained as a corporeal experience, an effective, embodied, emotional coming together of people and place. We perceive chemical and radioactive wastes as invasive, contaminating waterways, invading our bodies and transforming us in the process, making us ill. What separates this sense of the affective experience of heritage is not a qualitative difference in the nature of the embodied experience or transformative power of waste and heritage, but practices of categorization and valuing. The separation between the rubbish dump and the museum begins to erode in this comparison. What does it mean to present such comparisons now? In an epoch defined by the infiltration of radionuclides into the Earth's very geology, in the Anthropocene when a sense of the separation or isolation of humans from that thing we once called nature can no longer be maintained. In my book Heritage Critical Approaches, I asked rhetorically what it means to live amongst the ruins and spectral traces of the past, the heterogeneous piling up of historic materials in the present. And I think perhaps on the basis of the project, I'm ready now to venture an answer. Living with heritage and waste means collaborating with both, engaging thoughtfully in world-making practices which acknowledge the interconnectedness of each. Living with heritage and waste, the traces and residues we inherit are also often transformed by these practices of categorization and valuing, which relegate them to one or other space, the rubbish dump or museum. But these are the materials we will work with and through, and which in turn work with and through us. These traces equally constitute the legacies with which future generations of humans and non-humans will collaborate to assemble future worlds. Futures which are not predetermined, but which remain open, emergent, unformed, and multiple. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rodney, for that really great talk with, I think, a lot of really powerful, rich, and quite unconventional insights, and a very, very wide view as well. And I'm sure there's a lot there for us to take away and to digest, but these are ideas that can perhaps help many of us reposition a lot of the heritage problems and commonplaces that we work with, step out of our path dependencies and that kind of thing. So we have just over 15 minutes for questions. So I'd like to open the floor and see if there are any. Have we got a roving mic that we can hand out as well? Thank you, David. Areti.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering whether you could give us a little bit more insight on ideas of reusability and how they maybe interface with the things that you've been talking about, and also kind of understandings of reusability as a caring mechanism in either side, I guess, of the narrative here, and how they affect the sort of things that might be shareable or not shareable between the disciplines or between the practices.
I'm feeling that if you prefer, that might work. It's up to you.
Yeah, maybe just yes. I mean, I think the question of reuse and recycling of waste is obviously a very important one, and one can see, I mean, the minute you start making these comparisons, you see the ways in which certain terms flow between the different fields. So the ways in which adaptive reuse is being, in the historic environment, is being connected with the notion of sustainability via the sort of place of the discourse of reuse and recycling within a sort of more environmental framing of engaging with waste. So, I mean, there are problems with each of these terms too, and things that I think that we need to engage critically with. A lot of the work on reuse and sustainability is also about reframing certain late liberal practices which are to do with the accumulation of capitals, which may also not be things that we see as morally or ethically sustainable. So sometimes these things act as a kind of ruse for something else, and I think that's maybe the point that I was trying to make about biodiversity. Because of the sort of moral weight of natural heritage conservation, we never question the moral correctness of conserving polar bears, for example. We would be monsters to suggest that this was a bad thing to do. But that also removes it from critical investigation, and I think thinking about the ways in which biodiversity conservation also engages with the rise of a new bioeconomy and a new forms of biocapitals, and the biopolitics of those new forms of biocapitals and the ways in which they're generated is quite urgent and overdue. What does the sort of urgency of the extinction narrative conceal, and how can we engage it productively and thoughtfully, but also in a way that allows us to understand the other sorts of things that it's doing? So, I mean, for me, that's the point of a critical heritage studies. It's not to criticize, but it's to open it up to scrutiny and to inform people so that they can make informed choices about the futures that they build in one way or another. Maybe I didn't answer the question, but...
Okay, any other questions?
Hi, thank you. That was a really, really great talk. I'm really interested in the connections between sustainability and well-being, and I was just thinking in your talk then how recycling and adaptive reuse is quite often at the moment reframed as sort of a means to well-being. Recycling is good for the world and it's good for you, and increasingly heritage sites are being reframed as places to go for well-being and are used for conversations about how we might live better in the future. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about those connections.
Yeah, I worry about them a little bit. I mean, I think one wants to... The reason I worry about the kind of current connection of heritage and well-being is that I don't see it necessarily being well supported by an evidence base. And I would like to see some investigation of whether some of the kind of things that seem to be emerging as truisms about the relationship between heritage and well-being could actually be said to be true. Because we know that a lot of heritage is actually really about making difference. So heritage is often said to be, so we hear it's an enabler and a driver of sustainable development. I've written this phrase many, many times in many different places. But we also know that it's something that people fight about, and it's a way in which people actually justify acting on different parts of the population in more or less liberal governmental fashion. So I think one needs to bear in mind, what are the end products of those practices, in terms of the sort of the part of heritage which is really about making difference. So I think there is a sort of over-valorization of heritage, and it's very easy to fall into it because, you know, heritage is underfunded and at risk, and we all have projects that we're involved in that we want to support. And then it becomes very easy to sort of use that framing to justify seeking resources for that thing. But I think it's also helpful to do the critical thing at the same time.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, if there aren't any, I'll just take an opportunity to ask one as well, which was really going back to the meditations on critical heritage studies. In the context of a project like this that's really about, you know, thinking about future making, there seems to be a lot of obvious and necessary creativity to what you're doing, and also to the processes that you're interested in. There's a lot of speculative activity, a lot of what looked like play. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that from a sort of a methodological, I don't want to use the word discipline because I don't like to think of heritage studies as a discipline, but from a sort of an intellectual point of view in relation to critical heritage studies, what about play and what about these sorts of more open kinds of ways of building knowledge or ideas?
Thanks. I often don't take a chance to reflect on the parts of the project which had to do with knowledge exchange, which are in some ways the most radical parts of the project, and they were the hardest and scariest parts of it, because it's a bit of a leap of faith to get 30 people from wildly different contexts together and ask them to sort of engage collectively in some sort of activity. So we've been lucky to have enormous amounts of goodwill amongst the team of people that we work with who are willing to sort of suspend disbelief and come to some strange place with us for a week and do odd things. But it does require, it's a lot of work, and it requires producing a context in which it's possible for people to think outside of their ordinary context about what may initially seem to be quite odd things, you know, the long-term futures, making worlds. These are all sort of different. So, I mean, we've done, and I have to really acknowledge the work of the research associates on the project, because they've really designed a lot of this themselves, and they've done really, really strong, solid, important work in the context of the project. But we've had to design these sort of contexts where we do the kind of classic anthropological thing of doing very close looking at something different from the context that everyone else comes from. So in the case of nuclear waste disposal, this isn't a field that people know very well, and it helps to establish a certain reflective attitude to actually go and look really closely at something else. And so we often do a sort of field visit, and we have presentations from people that are involved in that field. But then we do a lot of play. Some of it is learning how to do the things that the people that work in that context do. So when we went to Kew, we learnt how to press tomatoes and flowers, and how the classification systems work. And so that was some of the slides that I just showed there. Some of it was thinking about classification. So we did the biscuit taxonomy, which is think about different ways of organising different kinds of biscuits.
That was my other question, was what's going on with the biscuits?
It's biscuit taxonomy. And in one case, we have developed a card game, which is for people that work in heritage organisations. It draws on a card game developed by Situation Lab called The Future Thing. Is that right? Thing from the Future. And we have our heritage version of this card game, which we took to the ICOMOS General Assembly in Delhi. And it it's to help people think much more specifically about the future. So rather than the future as a sort of moral category or a place with no temporal framework, it tries to help people think through very specific future scenarios in relation to this game. So I think play and speculation is really important, and I think we need to do more of it.
Okay, any final questions? Okay, I assume this reticence is because this talk was so rich and mind-blowing that people have to digest it and think through its various problems, and no doubt you will have lots of questions in the break as well. So we can move perhaps a few minutes early into the coffee break. So I think we have around half an hour for a coffee break, but before you all disappear, can I just ask you to thank once again Professor Rodney Harrison for our brilliant keynote.